Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Leaman, and I'm the CEO of Axonify, and I'm here today with Lisa LaBruno, the Senior VP of Retail Operations at RELA. Thanks for joining me, Lisa. I'm really excited to talk about the most topical issue in the industry today, which is the issue of racial profiling and unlawful detainment, and as it relates specifically to training, which is near and dear to our heart. So my questions, Lisa, are going to revolve around that general issue, and I'm wondering if we can start with a question around unlawful detainment and how you think today's training needs need to address this concern.
Yeah, so Carol, as you said, there's been a lot of dialogue over the last few months around racial profiling in connection with external apprehensions. And I think every LP executive would say that their training program centers around the need to mitigate the risk associated with stopping any customer unlawfully, regardless of that customer's race. And as I approach training around LP apprehensions, I put it into four buckets. The first being the mechanism by which that training is delivered, the specific components of a successful training program, metrics for success, and obviously any effective training program has to have a review component to it. So if we go back to the first, that is the mechanism by which training is delivered, I think we would all agree that we all learn differently. I may respond better to words on paper versus you may respond better to face-to-face training. So I think any effective training program would offer various mechanisms by which LP associates can receive it. So training on paper, perhaps an e-learning component to the training, and then also a face-to-face on-the-job, sort of train the trainer component to the training. Second, specific components of training. I could talk for hours about that, but I think that the fundamental principles associated with apprehensions need to be covered in any training program. So the most fundamental premise is LP associates should base their initial approach on the conduct of the subject, and certainly not on attributes, physical attributes that have nothing to do or no correlation with whether or not that person is shoplifting. And obviously race plays no part in that whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Treating shoplifters with respect is as hard a pill as it may be to swallow. Even if they're stealing from you, they deserve to be treated with respect and professionally. And one of the many benefits associated with that is if you have made a mistake, and there's going to be mistakes. Mistakes are always going to be made. The retail industry, they are stopping tens of thousands of shoplifters every year. And so for us to think that there's going to be perfection, I think is unrealistic. But if you make a mistake and you treat the customer with respect and you treat them professionally and you get it done swiftly, I think the likelihood of that customer returning to the store is far more likely than if you treated them poorly. Third, metrics. LP associates are under a tremendous amount of pressure, particularly with ORC growing every day. And if the only way by which we are measuring an LP associate's success is by the number of apprehensions that they make, I think that's a recipe for disaster is probably too strong a word, but it's a recipe for mistakes, more mistakes to happen. And if we think about the world of apprehensions from a more global perspective and think through alternate scenarios that might not result in an apprehension, but are nonetheless successful, i.e. recover the merchandise, I think that's a good consideration to always keep in mind. Example, if an LP associate is observing somebody and there's an opportunity to contact a non-LP associate to engage in some good customer service, and that subject discards the merchandise and leaves the store, to me that's an ideal scenario, because you've not initiated a detention, and so you don't have to worry about the risk of stopping a potentially innocent customer. No one's going to get injured, and you've recovered your merchandise. And so if retailers can consider additional metrics that measure the effectiveness of an LP associate inside the store, and most importantly, acknowledge, we all like to be acknowledged for our sound decision making and good efforts. And so if the supervisory team is willing to acknowledge the LP associates for those good decisions, I think we're well on our way to mitigating the risk. And then the fourth is a review component. Every training program has to have a review component. If problems go unaddressed, however small or big, then again, we're putting ourselves in a bit of a difficult situation. And so I would encourage training programs that include components around supervisors reviewing case reports, making sure that CCTV evidence aligns with what is being said in the report. We can mitigate the risk of racial profiling, unlawful detainment of customers of all races, and essentially protect the brand of the retailer. And to the extent concerns are identified through that review process, people need to be coached, they need to be trained, and in extreme cases, need to be disciplined. So that's, again, I could talk about training forever. Those are sort of the four primary buckets that I see should be a part of any effective training program.
Completely agree. I think that's a really comprehensive review of the need that exists today. So just on that, what would you say have been the biggest changes over the last 5 or 10 years in terms of the retail environment that kind of play to this whole issue?
Yeah, so if we stick to that topic of unlawful detainment, what I would say is in this economic climate that continues to be quite challenging, I think retailers continue to be under a considerable amount of pressure to ensure that they don't lose a single customer. And to the extent LP associates are regularly detaining customers unlawfully, I think the risk of losing customers is significant. Customers won't return if they feel like they are being accused of something they didn't do, and if they are being mistreated during that process. And so I think that pressure to keep the sale really trickles down to the LP organization, because they are one of the few functions within the retail organization that can potentially have some pretty volatile engagements with the customer base, and they need to have the tools to manage through those interactions. I also think that organized retail crime continues to put considerable pressure on LP personnel, more so today than 10 years ago. I think that LP folks are very committed to mitigating the risk of ORC, to keeping product on the shelves so that it's available to their legitimate customers. Again, getting back to that conversation around needing to provide a shoppable experience for their customers so their customers keep coming back. And that's a very difficult challenge that LP personnel are tasked with tackling. And their one mistake can have pretty significant consequences from a sales perspective, from a brand damage perspective, from a litigation perspective. So I would say that the continued economic climate coupled with the growing problem of ORC continues to put a whole lot of pressure on LP, on the organization, and particularly those folks in the store who have a really difficult job.
Exactly, and of course with the proliferation of social media, you can't keep anything out of the media these days.
Well, what's also interesting is these ORC enterprises continue to get more and more sophisticated. And frankly, I think they're becoming more and more violent because the stakes are higher for them these days. As the retail industry continues to educate their law enforcement partners, their prosecutor partners, and judges, and they become more aware of the extent of the problem and the need to aggressively prosecute offenders, stakes are necessarily going to be higher. The ORC folks know this, and it's sort of a win at all costs. And so we're seeing an escalation in violence by these folks. So I certainly don't envy the job of an in-store LP associate, and certainly have all the respect for them that I could possibly have for somebody in that kind of position.
Absolutely. And so you've got the LP associate, who is obviously the front facing to the whole issue. You also have the customer facing retail associate. And what do you see are the challenges in terms of training each of those groups of people that the retailers have about being aware of these issues, how to deal with these issues? They're two different groups to train.
Sure. You know, I would say that, look, an in-store LP associate goes into that job because they either have a passion for the work, they're wired that way, they know going into that job that they will likely find themselves in a situation where they are approaching suspected shoplifters who could be dangerous, versus your front-end cashier who goes into his or her job not wired the same way, not having most likely a passion for internal, external theft or stopping people, and you know, might not be as inclined to receive training around apprehensions. And frankly, retailers, those who are responsible for delivering the training, when they hire their cashier, they're probably not thinking to themselves, oh, I need to get that cashier some apprehension training. And so there's that challenge, number one. You know, number two, you know, and I don't have the hardcore numbers here, but in terms of turnover, right? You know, cashiers turn, LP associates turn. I don't know what the difference is in the rate, but as these folks turn, it becomes increasingly challenging to train these folks. Costly for sure, but a cost that retailers are certainly willing to incur because they understand the consequences associated with this sort of job responsibility. But I think that turnover presents quite a significant challenge. And how far do you go with the training with front-end cashiers or salespeople? Yes, they're customer facing much of the time, but how involved do they get in engaging suspected shoplifters? That varies from retailer to retailer. The training is going to have to vary from retailer to retailer.
Super. Thanks very much, Lisa. Those were clearly, you're passionate about the topic, have a wealth of knowledge, and that was a really enlightening set of remarks. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol.